My stepdaughter had a binder. That was the detail that stayed with me. Not the moving truck idling at the curb of the house I had lived in for 22 years. Not the December rain blowing in cold off Charleston Harbor and soaking the hem of my Sunday coat. Not even my own suitcases lined up on the veranda of the single house on Lamball Street like luggage forgotten outside a hotel. It was the binder. A 3-inch white 3-ring binder with color-coded plastic tabs that my stepdaughter Marguerite carried under her arm on the morning she put me out. The first tab read Estate Inventory. The second tab read Verbal Script for Conversation. The third tab read Locksmith 1100 Confirmation. I saw the tabs because she let me see them, the way a tax auditor lets you see the spreadsheet, the way a banker lets you see the foreclosure timeline. The binder was the point. The binder was the message. Adelaide, this isn't personal. That was Marguerite, 32 years old, standing on the brick walk in pearls and a navy blazer, wearing the same composed expression she had worn at her father's funeral 8 weeks earlier. The will is the will. Daddy left the property to me. I have every right to take possession. You have every right to find somewhere else to live, Marguerite. Your father died 8 weeks ago, and I gave you 8 weeks to find a place. That is 8 weeks more than the will required. I want to be precise about what the will required because the precision is going to matter. Augustus Mosby, my husband of 22 years, died on October 14, 2025, of a heart attack at his desk at the law firm he had founded on Broad Street. He was 69. I had been Marguerite's stepmother for 24 years, having come into her life when she was 8 years old, and her biological mother had been gone for 4 years already. Augustus's will, drafted in March of 2003 and never amended in spite of 22 years of marriage, left the house, the savings, the brokerage accounts, and the 50% partnership stake in Mosby and Latimer LLP, together valued at approximately $3.4 million, entirely to Marguerite, to his biological daughter, his only child. I was not mentioned by name in the will. I was not mentioned in the will at all. The document had been drafted when Augustus and I had been engaged for 6 months when the relationship was new, when I suppose he had not yet learned to think of me as the kind of woman whose name belongs on a will. He had meant to update it. He had said so 100 times across 2 decades. I need to call Henley about the will, Della. I keep meaning to. Henley was the attorney, Henley Babcock, a stooped, courteous man who had been Augustus's friend since law school. Henley had reminded Augustus to amend the will in 2009, in 2014, and again in 2020. Augustus had said he would handle it. He had not handled it. On October 14, 2025, at 11:43 in the morning, my husband collapsed at his desk while reviewing deposition transcripts in a wrongful death suit, and the will he had meant to update for 22 years became the legal instrument that decided the next chapter of my life. The next chapter began on the brick walk of the Lamball Street house on a December afternoon with a stepdaughter holding a 3-ring binder and using the word personal as if she had any standing to define what was and was not personal between us. Marguerite, I helped raise you. You married my father. There is a difference. She called me Adelaide, not Mama. She had never called me Mama. I had never asked her to. But for 24 years she had called me Della, the soft, shortened version, the affectionate version, the version that had meant something between us. On the brick walk of a house I had lived in for 22 years, she called me Adelaide, and the formality of those 3 syllables told me everything about what was coming next. The boxes on the veranda contained 24 years of a life that had been efficiently sorted into the category of things Marguerite considered mine, and the category of things Marguerite considered the estate's. The distinction had been made by Marguerite alone, sometime in the 8 weeks between her father's burial at Magnolia Cemetery and that December morning, and it had been made with the cold accounting of a woman who had recently passed the South Carolina bar and had apparently decided to practice her first probate matter on her own family. My clothing was mine. The set of copper pots I had bought one at a time over 15 years at the Saturday market on Marion Square was the estate's, because the pots had been used in the estate's kitchen. My books were mine. The pine bookshelves Augustus had built me for our 10th anniversary were the estates. My mother's quilt, brought from her house in McClellanville when I married Augustus in 2003, was mine. The four-poster bed it had rested on for 22 years was somehow the estate's. I did not argue. I had not argued about any of it. I had simply watched for 8 weeks as Marguerite walked the rooms of the house with her phone open to a spreadsheet app, photographing furniture, dictating notes, attaching color-coded labels to the underside of every object. And I had understood with a clarity that surprised me that the girl I had raised since she was 8 years old had been waiting, perhaps for years, to perform exactly this operation. I loaded the boxes into a 2019 Honda CR-V that Augustus and I had bought together, and that mercifully had been titled in both our names, which meant it was the one significant asset I retained from 22 years of marriage. I drove the Honda down Trad Street to East Bay, then south on Savannah Highway through the long stretch of strip malls and seafood shacks until I reached the Palmetto Court Motor Lodge, the only motel within 30 miles of downtown, with a weekly rate I could afford on a substitute teacher's income of $33,400 a year. I checked into a room on the second floor, room 217, that smelled like fryer grease from the Bojangles next door, despite the no-smoking sign on the door. I sat on the bed. I did not cry. I had done the crying in the 8 weeks between the funeral and the locksmith, in the privacy of a downstairs guest bedroom Marguerite had insisted I move into the day after the burial. "Just until you figure out your next steps, Adelaide," she had said, with the calm officiousness of an attorney managing a difficult client. The tears were finished. What replaced them in that fryer-scented room of a Palmetto Court Motor Lodge on Savannah Highway was something quieter and more useful. The slow, methodical anger of a 64-year-old woman who had spent a lifetime being reasonable and had finally arrived at the precise moment when reasonableness had cost her everything. But before I tell you about the knock on the motel door 2 months later, before I tell you about the woman who introduced herself on the threshold of room 217 and the brown leather portfolio she carried under her arm that would unmake everything Marguerite believed about herself, I need to tell you who I was before any of this. Because the woman who checked into the Palmetto Court was a woman who had spent 24 years believing she had built something with the Mosby family. My name is Adelaide Forrester, the surname I have just legally reclaimed after 22 years as Adelaide Mosby. I was born on May 12, 1961, in McClellanville, South Carolina, a fishing village 40 miles north of Charleston, the only daughter of a shrimper and a church organist. I grew up in a clapboard cottage on Pinckney Street, the kind of house that smelled like marsh mud and lemon polish, helping my mother arrange hymnals on Saturday afternoons before the Sunday service, doing my homework on the screened porch while my father mended his nets in the side yard. I went to South Carolina State University in Orangeburg on a partial scholarship, studied elementary education, graduated in 1983, and began teaching 3rd grade at Mitchell Math and Science School on the Charleston Peninsula that same fall. I taught for 20 years before I met Augustus. I have always been, by inclination and training, a woman who watches children carefully and learns to read what they are not saying. I should have read Marguerite more carefully. I met Augustus Mosby in the spring of 2002 at a benefit for the Avery Research Center at the College of Charleston, the kind of community event where the city's black professional class gathered to drink mediocre champagne and write checks to institutions that preserve the parts of our history the city would otherwise prefer to forget. I was 41 years old, unmarried, a 3rd grade teacher with a small apartment on Cumming Street and a life I had built carefully and on my own terms. Augustus was 47, a widower of 4 years, an attorney specializing in maritime and probate law with an 8-year-old daughter, and a reputation in Charleston for taking on civil rights cases the bigger firms would not touch. His first wife, Eliza Mosby, born Eliza Pemberton in Columbia in 1965, had died of breast cancer in November of 2001 when Marguerite was 7. The story I was told that night by Augustus himself, over plastic flutes of champagne, was that Eliza had been diagnosed in January of 2001, that she had died in November of the same year, and that the 10 months between diagnosis and burial had been the worst of his life. He had spent the 4 years since then trying to raise Marguerite alone and trying to remember how to be a person who was not actively grieving. I want to be clear about what Augustus told me about Eliza, because what he told me became the foundation of everything I believed about Marguerite for the next 24 years. Eliza Pemberton, born in Columbia in 1965, had been a public defender in Charleston County. She had met Augustus in 1992, married him in 1993, given birth to Marguerite in March of 1993. The marriage, by Augustus's account, had been a happy one until the diagnosis. There had never, he said, been any question about Marguerite. Marguerite was Eliza's daughter in every legal and biological sense that mattered. Augustus had a framed photograph on his desk of Eliza holding newborn Marguerite in the maternity ward at Roper Hospital. He had 1,000 photographs in albums of the three of them together. He had the kind of grief that does not need to be explained because it is visible in the way a man stands at the kitchen sink at 11 at night staring at nothing. I believed him. There was no reason not to. I married Augustus Mosby in October of 2003 in a small ceremony at Mother Emanuel AME Church on Calhoun Street with 38 guests, and a reception at a restaurant on East Bay overlooking the harbor. Marguerite was 10 years old. She was the flower girl. She wore a small white dress with a sash the color of muscadine wine. She smiled in the photographs. She did not call me Mama that day or any day, and I did not expect her to. I had not come into her life to replace Eliza. I had come into her life to be something new, the second woman, the stepmother, the one who would help raise her without pretending to have given birth to her. I was clear with her about this from the beginning. I am not trying to be your mama, Marguerite. I am just going to be Adelaide. I am going to be here, and I am going to help, and I am going to love you, and you do not have to call me anything you do not want to call me. She called me. By her 11th birthday, by the 7th month of my marriage to her father, she had landed on Della, and I had let her keep it because it was her choice, and because it sounded in her 11-year-old voice like an accomplishment. For 22 years I was Della to Marguerite. I drove her to ballet at the Charleston Academy 3 afternoons a week from age 10 through age 19. I sat with her in the kitchen on Lamball Street and helped her with long division, and then pre-algebra, and then in high school with her college application essays. When she was 16 and got her learner's permit, I was the one who took her out driving on the back roads of Johns Island and Wadmalaw because Augustus's anxiety made him a terrible passenger and a worse instructor. When Marguerite was 18 and accepted to Spelman College in Atlanta, I cried in the kitchen, and Marguerite hugged me and said, "Thanks, Della, for everything." She meant it. I am certain she meant it. The girl who said those words was not the woman who stood on the brick walk 14 years later and called me Adelaide. Something changed in Marguerite somewhere between her graduation from Spelman in 2015 and her graduation from the University of South Carolina School of Law in 2019. I have spent the months since Augustus's death trying to identify the exact moment, the precise turn, and I cannot. It was gradual, the way an oyster shell erodes in the tide. The phone calls became shorter. The visits home became less frequent. The Della became Adelaide in certain contexts, when Marguerite was speaking about me to her colleagues, or eventually to her husband, a man named Tate Whitlock, an investment advisor she had met at a wedding in Hilton Head and married in the spring of 2022 in a ceremony I helped pay for. Tate was polite to me in the manner of a man who had been briefed. There was something rehearsed in his warmth, something I noted at the time and then dismissed as the natural awkwardness of a new son-in-law meeting his wife's stepmother. I understand now that Tate had been told something about me by Marguerite that had shaped his every interaction with me from the moment we met. I do not know exactly what she told him. I suspect it was some version of the story Marguerite would eventually tell herself out loud on the brick walk on Lamball Street. The story in which I was a woman who had married her father, who had occupied her mother's house, who had been pleasant company for 2 decades, but who had never been, in any meaningful sense, family. The story in which I was a long-term guest. The reading of the will took place on November 4th, 2025, 3 weeks after Augustus's death, in the conference room of Henley Babcock's office on Meeting Street. Henley had been Augustus's attorney for 35 years. He was 73 years old with a kind of careful low-country decorum that meant he never raised his voice and never gave you the satisfaction of seeing his reaction to what he was reading. He read the will aloud. He explained that the document had been executed in March of 2003, 6 months before my marriage to Augustus, and that it had never been amended. He explained that under the terms of the will, the entirety of Augustus's estate, including the house on Lamball Street, the 50% partnership stake in Mosby and Latimer LLP, the joint brokerage accounts that had been funded primarily through Augustus's income over the past 22 years, and the contents of the household, passed to Marguerite Mosby Whitlock as sole beneficiary. He explained that I was entitled to the contents of one joint checking account containing approximately $6,800 and to the 2019 Honda CR-V because the title was in both our names. Henley looked at me when he finished reading. His face was composed, but his eyes carried the specific apology of an attorney who has seen this exact scenario play out before and who knows that the law does not require fairness. "Adelaide," he said, "I want you to know that I spoke with Augustus about updating this will at least 3 times. He intended to. He simply did not." Marguerite was sitting across the conference table. She was wearing a charcoal suit I had never seen before. She was 32 years old, the same age I had been when I started teaching at Mitchell Math and Science, and her face during Henley's reading had been a study in controlled neutrality. When Henley finished speaking, Marguerite said, "I understand this is difficult, Adelaide. I want to be reasonable. I will give you 8 weeks to find suitable accommodations and remove your personal belongings from the house. I want you to hear that sentence the way I heard it. I will give you." As if the house had been Marguerite's all along and my 22 years of living in it had been an accommodation she had been generous enough to permit. "I will give you." The 2 words a landlord uses with a tenant who has fallen behind on the rent. I did not respond. I did not have words for what I was feeling. I simply nodded, stood up, and walked out of the conference room. The 8 weeks between the will reading and the locksmith were the strangest 8 weeks of my life. Marguerite moved into the house on Lamball Street within days of the funeral, citing the need to begin transitioning the estate. She took the master bedroom. She moved my belongings into the small guest bedroom on the 1st floor, the narrow room with the sloped ceiling where I had stored Christmas decorations for 22 years. She framed this as a kindness. "You can stay here while you find a place, Adelaide. I want to make this as smooth as possible for everyone." Her husband Tate visited on weekends, walking through the rooms of the house with the appraising eye of a man planning a renovation, occasionally asking Marguerite questions about which pieces of furniture were staying and which were being sold. They spoke about me in the 3rd person in my presence. They did this without malice, I think. They simply did not see me as a person whose hearing required consideration. I spent those 8 weeks in a state of dissociative observation. I cooked dinner most nights because Marguerite and Tate did not cook, and because I had cooked dinner in that kitchen for 22 years, and because the muscle memory of preparing a meal was the only thing that made the days feel structured. I watched Marguerite sort through Augustus's office, his law books, his trial files, the small mahogany box on his dresser where he had kept his father's railroad watch and his college class ring. I watched her photograph furniture and post listings on a curated estate sale website. I watched her receive an appraiser from a Charleston antiques dealer, an older woman with a clipboard who walked through the house, evaluating the Persian rugs and the dining room set, and the mid-century pieces Augustus, and I had collected together at Saturday auctions in Walterboro and Somerville. The appraiser looked at me at one point in the dining room with an expression of profound discomfort and asked Marguerite in a low voice, "Is this an estate sale?" And Marguerite said, "It's a transition. The previous resident is relocating." The previous resident, that was me. In the home I had lived in for 22 years, I had been reclassified as the previous resident, and the woman with the clipboard was uncomfortable enough that she would not meet my eyes for the rest of her visit. On the morning of the locksmith, December 9th, 2025, I walked through the house one last time before the boxes were carried outside. I went into the master bedroom where Augustus and I had slept for 22 years, and where Marguerite and Tate had been sleeping for 8 weeks. I went into Augustus's office, where I had brought him coffee 1,000 mornings while he marked up briefs at the roll-top desk by the window. I went into the kitchen where I had taught Marguerite to roll out biscuit dough when she was 11, where I had decorated her birthday cakes from age 10 through age 18, where I had stood at the sink and watched the Spanish moss shift in the live oak in the side yard every winter for 2 decades. I did not cry. I had decided somewhere in those 8 weeks that I would not give Marguerite the gift of my tears. She had taken enough. She would not take that. The Palmetto Court Motor Lodge on Savannah Highway became my residence. I paid $310 a week, which on a substitute teacher's salary of $33,400 a year meant I was burning through the $6,800 in the joint checking account at a rate that would leave me destitute by April. I needed permanent housing. I needed a full-time teaching position, having let my regular certification lapse during my marriage, when Augustus had earned enough that we had decided I would substitute teach for the flexibility. I needed to do 100 practical things, and I did them methodically in the fryer-scented room with the wobbling television stand and the air conditioner that rattled all night. What I did not do during those first weeks at the Palmetto Court was think very hard about Marguerite's biological mother. Eliza Mosby, dead since 2001, was a closed file in my mind. I had no reason to open it. I would have a reason in approximately 7 weeks. The knock came on February 11th, 2026 at 5:48 in the evening. I remember the exact time because I had just gotten back from a long-term substitute assignment at Buist Academy on Calhoun Street, a 4-week stint covering for a 4th-grade reading specialist on family leave, and I had been sitting on the edge of the bed in room 217 of the Palmetto Court, counting the cash from a side job, tutoring a 6th grader in Mount Pleasant on Tuesday evenings. I was tired in the specific way that 64-year-old women are tired after spending 6 hours managing 24 9-year-olds. I almost did not answer the door. I assumed it was housekeeping, or the front desk clerk, or one of the other long-term residents who occasionally knocked to ask if I had spare quarters for the coin laundry behind the building. I opened the door anyway. Standing in the open-air walkway was a woman I had never seen before. She was in her early 60s, slim, with silver-streaked locks pulled back from her face, wearing a long camel coat and holding a brown leather portfolio under her arm. Her skin was the same warm brown as Marguerite's. Her eyes, when they met mine, were the same wide-set hazel as Marguerite's. I did not recognize the resemblance in that first moment. I was too focused on the strangeness of her presence at my door. "Mrs. Mosby." Her voice was low and careful, with the lilt of someone who had grown up speaking French at home and English everywhere else. "Forrester, I have gone back to my maiden name. Can I help you? My name is Solange Dowsett. I am sorry to come to you like this. I drove here from New Orleans and I would have called ahead, but I did not have your number. I traced you to this address through a paralegal in Charleston who used to work with a friend of mine. I need to talk to you about Marguerite, about Eliza, about March of 1993. I want to describe what happened in my body when this stranger said the name Eliza. Eliza Mosby had been dead for 25 years. Eliza Mosby had been a closed chapter in a story that, until 14 weeks ago, I had believed was settled. The mention of her name by a 63-year-old woman from New Orleans I had never seen before, standing in the second-floor walkway of a motel on Savannah Highway, produced a sensation I can only describe as the slow inversion of gravity. The walkway tilted. The hand resting against the door frame became the only stable point in the world. "You had better come in." Solange Dowsett sat in the chair by the window, the only chair in room 217. I sat on the edge of the bed. She placed the brown leather portfolio on the small particle board table between us. She did not open it immediately. She looked at me for a long moment, the way a woman looks when she is trying to decide where to begin a story she has rehearsed for years and that she has never been allowed to tell. "Mrs. Forrester, I want to start by saying I am sorry. I am sorry for the timing. I am sorry that you are hearing this from a stranger in a motel room. I am sorry that I waited 32 years to come find you. I had reasons that seemed good to me at the time, and they do not seem good to me now. Mrs. Dowsett, please, just say what you came to say." She nodded. She opened the portfolio. She removed a photograph and slid it across the table. It was a photograph of a young woman, perhaps 21, in a white maternity smock, taken in what looked like a hospital chapel. The photograph was dated in pen on the back, March 4, 1993. "Roper Hospital, Charleston. That is me the day before Marguerite was born. I was 21 years old. I was a music student at Tulane in New Orleans. The year before, in the spring of 1992, I had spent 4 months in Charleston working as a cocktail singer at a hotel bar on Market Street. I had a brief relationship with a saxophone player named Cyrus Beauchamp, who left town in July and did not leave a forwarding address. I was pregnant by the end of August. I did not know it until October." She drew a breath. "My mother in New Orleans was a deaconess at our church. She would not let me come home pregnant. She had a cousin in Charleston who knew a woman, Eliza Mosby, the wife of an attorney who had been trying for years to have a baby and could not. An arrangement was made. I came back to Charleston in January of 1993. I lived in a guest house behind Eliza's family home on South Battery for 8 weeks. I gave birth to Marguerite at Roper Hospital on the morning of March 5, 1993. Eliza was in the delivery room with me. We had practiced a story. The hospital staff was told Eliza was the mother. Eliza's name was placed on the birth certificate. I signed papers in a lawyer's office on East Bay 2 days later, surrendering all parental rights. I was paid $18,000, and I was put on a Greyhound bus back to New Orleans on March 9th. I never saw my daughter again." She paused. She looked out the window of room 217 at the parking lot. Augustus Mosby was Marguerite's father. Eliza Mosby was not her biological mother. I was. I did not speak. I could not. The room was no longer tilting. The room was perfectly still. "Mrs. Dowsett, when you say Augustus was Marguerite's father, do you mean?" "I mean he was the man who raised her. I mean his name went on the documents at the courthouse in Columbia in 1994 when he and Eliza filed an amended birth certificate that was already false. I do not mean he was her biological father, Mrs. Forrester. Cyrus Beauchamp was Marguerite's biological father. Augustus Mosby never knew that. Eliza Mosby knew. I told Eliza the truth in January of 1993 when I came back to Charleston. She told me to never tell Augustus. She said he would not take the baby if he knew, and she needed him to take the baby. So I never told him. For 32 years, I never told anyone." She slid a second document across the table. It was a DNA test result, the kind a commercial laboratory produces, dated September of 2025, comparing samples from Solange Dowsett and Marguerite Mosby Whitlock. The conclusion line read, "Probability of biological maternity, 99.997%. You took a DNA test together." "No, we never took one together. Marguerite took an ancestry test in the spring of 2023. She uploaded her raw data to a public genealogy database. I had uploaded mine in 2019, hoping that if my daughter ever wanted to find me, she could. When she uploaded her data, the system matched us automatically as a parent-child relationship. She was notified. I was notified. She saw the notification, Mrs. Forrester. She has known since April of 2023 that Eliza Mosby was not her biological mother and that Augustus Mosby was not her biological father. The room tilted again. She knew. She has known for almost 3 years that Augustus was not her. Yes, the database keeps a record of every match that is viewed and acknowledged. Marguerite viewed the match on April 19, 2023. She acknowledged it. She sent me a private message through the database's internal messaging system on April 21st. I have a copy of the message. She slid a third document across the table. It was a printed screenshot of a message dated April 21st, 2023, from a user identified as Marguerite Mosby Whitlock to a user identified as Solange Dowsett. The message read, "Ms. Dowsett, I see that the database has matched us as parent and child. I do not know who you are, and I do not wish to know. My mother was Eliza Mosby. She has been my mother since I was born. My father is Theodore Augustus Mosby. I am writing to ask that you not contact me, not contact my father, and not contact anyone in my family regarding this match. I understand this is a strange request from a stranger. I hope you will respect it. I will be removing my profile from the database after I send this message." She had removed her profile. But Solange had screenshotted the match and the message before the removal, because Solange, in her own words, had been a woman who had spent 30 years wondering if she would ever hear from her daughter. And when the message arrived telling her to disappear, she had not been willing to let the only evidence of the connection disappear with it. "I respected the request," Solange said. "I did not contact her. I did not contact Augustus. I did not contact anyone. For 2 years and 10 months I respected the request, and I lived with the knowledge that my daughter knew about me and had chosen not to know me. And then in January of this year, my niece in West Ashley called me. She had read in the Post and Courier that Augustus Mosby had died. She told me that Marguerite had moved her stepmother out of the house on Lamball Street. She told me that you had been given 8 weeks to leave. She told me you were a substitute teacher living in a motel on the highway. And I sat in my kitchen in New Orleans, Mrs. Forrester, and I did something I had not done in 32 years. I opened a drawer in my bureau and I took out the screenshot and I read the message again. And I asked myself a question I had been afraid to ask in 2023 when the message first came. The question was, what kind of woman sends that message? What kind of woman at age 30, having just discovered that the people who raised her were not biologically hers, has the composure to send a stranger a written request that she be erased? I had told myself in 2023 that she was protecting her grief. I told myself in January after my niece called that she was protecting her inheritance. She looked at me directly. "Mrs. Forrester, I am not here to claim my daughter. She has made her choice about me, and I respect it. I am here because I read the obituary in the Post and Courier, and I read that you were the surviving spouse, and I made some inquiries. I learned that you were a substitute teacher living in this motel. I learned that the will was a 22-year-old document that had never been updated. I learned that Marguerite, who has known since April of 2023 that she was not Augustus Mosby's biological child, allowed Augustus to die without ever telling him, and then accepted the entirety of an estate that was left to her on the explicit legal premise of biological daughterhood, and then used that estate to put out of her home the woman who had raised her for 24 years. I am here, Mrs. Forrester, because what Marguerite did is a fraud legally and morally, and I have driven 12 hours to give you the evidence to undo it." I looked at Solange Dowsett. I looked at the 3 documents on the table. I looked at the rattling air conditioner in the corner of room 217 of the Palmetto Court Motor Lodge on Savannah Highway. "Mrs. Dowsett, why are you doing this for me? You do not know me." She thought about the question for a long time, because Eliza would have wanted me to. Eliza was a kind woman, Mrs. Forrester, in spite of the lie. She told me before she died that she had written me a letter she wanted me to read someday. I never got the letter. I do not know if she ever sent it, but I know she would not have wanted her daughter to do this to the woman who took her place at that kitchen table. The attorney I hired was a woman named Henrietta Wakefield, a 57-year-old estate litigator with an office on Queen Street and a reputation in the Lowcountry for taking cases that other attorneys called unwinnable and winning them with the patient cruelty of a person who enjoyed her work. Solange paid the retainer. She insisted. "I have a pension from 30 years at the State University, Mrs. Forrester. I have no other children. Let me spend some of it on something that matters." I accepted because I had no choice, and because I had begun in the days following Solange's visit to understand that the question of Marguerite's inheritance was not a question of money. It was a question of whether a 32-year-old woman would be permitted to commit a fraud against her dying father, her stepmother, and the entire institution of inheritance law and walk away with $3.4 million as her reward. Henrietta reviewed the documents. She reviewed Augustus's will. She reviewed South Carolina probate statutes and the case law governing fraud in the procurement of testamentary gifts. She looked up from her desk after 3 hours and said, "Mrs. Forrester, your stepdaughter has a serious problem. South Carolina law does not require a testator to leave assets to a biological child, but South Carolina law does require that a beneficiary not procure or accept a testamentary gift through fraud or material concealment." Marguerite knew, beginning in April of 2023, that she was not Augustus's biological child. She had an affirmative obligation to disclose this to Augustus, who was, based on the 2003 will, leaving her an estate explicitly on the basis of that biological relationship. By concealing the information for almost 3 years and accepting the estate after his death, she has, in my professional opinion, committed actionable probate fraud. There is also the matter of the falsified 1993 birth certificate, which a probate court will not look kindly upon, and there is the question of your omitted spouse share. Under South Carolina law, you are entitled to elect against the will and claim a 1/3 elective share regardless of what the will says. Henley Babcock should have informed you of that right. He did not. We filed the petition on March 4, 2026. We requested an emergency injunction freezing the estate assets pending the outcome of the fraud claim. The injunction was granted on March 11. By March 12, Marguerite could not sell the house, could not transfer the partnership stake, could not liquidate the brokerage accounts. She called me on March 13. Her number was still saved in my phone under the name Marguerite. I answered. Her voice was different. The composed officiousness was gone. "Adelaide. My attorney says you have evidence that I knew about my biological mother before Daddy died. Adelaide, this is not what it looks like. Can we talk privately without attorneys?" "Marguerite, you had 24 years to talk to me privately. You used those years to call me Della. Then you used 8 weeks to call me Adelaide. You do not get a private conversation now. You get a courtroom." I hung up. The case did not go to trial. Marguerite's attorney contacted Henrietta in mid-May to discuss settlement. The settlement was finalized on June 1, 2026. Marguerite retained 25% of the estate. I received 60%. The remaining 15% was placed into a charitable trust in Augustus's name supporting the Avery Research Center at the College of Charleston, the institution at whose benefit Augustus and I had met in 2002. The house on Lambeau Street was sold. I did not want to live in it again. Proceeds, approximately $890,000, formed the core of a financial cushion that I will use to live the rest of my life with the dignity that 22 years of marriage should have, but did not automatically provide. I bought a small house in McClellanville, the town where I grew up. 2 bedrooms, a screened porch, a side yard where my father once mended his nets. I am back to teaching full-time at the elementary school where I started as a student teacher in 1983. I am 64 years old. I make $51,800 a year teaching 3rd grade. I have, for the first time in my adult life, a home that belongs entirely to me. Solange and I have stayed in touch. She visited Charleston in April. We are not in love. We are something more useful than love at 64 and 63. We are friends who share a strange specific history. She has invited me to New Orleans in October. I am going. Marguerite and I have not spoken since March 13th. Tate called me once in late May, after the settlement. He said he had not known. He said he was sorry. I told him I appreciated the call and did not need the apology and wished him well. If you have listened this far, look at who shows up. Look at who waits. Look at who drives 12 hours from New Orleans with a leather portfolio when they owe you nothing at all. Do not wait until a binder is on your veranda to know the difference. Share this with someone you have been carrying. Subscribe. There is always a next story. There is always someone, somewhere, knocking on a motel door at 5:48 in the evening, holding the evidence that will change everything.